Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to have you here. Welcome to St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Meredith Ward. I'm on the clergy team here, and on behalf of all of us here at St. Bart's, it's my delight and joy to welcome you here this morning. Whether you're here in the room, in person, or joining us online, we're very glad you're here. Each Sunday here at the Forum, we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. This morning, we are delighted to welcome Reverend Mark Fowler, who is the CEO of the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. He's going to tell us a little bit about the work that Tannenbaum does, but I'll just give you a brief preview, which is to say it promotes justice and builds respect for religious difference by transforming individuals and institutions to reduce prejudice, hatred, and violence. Mark's talk this morning is part of a larger theme that we're launching this fall, our theme for the year, which is a place at the table, which you're going to be hearing a lot about, both in forums and in classes and even in our worship over the next weeks and months ahead. So this morning, Mark is going to speak about building respect for religious difference. Mm-hmm. Mark, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Glad to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for all of those who are clapping at home or wherever you might be. I appreciate the warm welcome. So to get right into it, because I do want to make sure that we do have some time for questions at the end. Tannenbaum, or the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, is a secular and non-sectarian not-for-profit. So that means that we are not a religious organization in and of ourselves, but we recognize and for 31 years have been working around the power that religious belief and practice and diversity have in society. And in particular, we've been working in the 4 areas that you see on the slide. We, in our peace building work, actually, through an international search process, identify, write case studies, and try to raise the profile of religiously and spiritually motivated individuals who are working for peace in active conflict zones around the world. And they are recognized for the work that they've done, even if they've left that work, in an active conflict zone. So places like Israel, Palestine, the Sudan, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Papua West New Guinea, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq. All of our peacemakers in some way have done some work around working for peace and continue to do that work. In our education work, we provide training and resources to educators and school systems on creating religiously inclusive classrooms. And what that means is building the social and emotional learning skills for K through 12 students so that they are both curious about religious diversity, but that they also have the tools to engage with one another when something is unfamiliar or when they don't know, they've come across someone whose religious beliefs they're unfamiliar with. In our healthcare work, we work with medical providers, non-clinical staff, and hospital institutions in the ways in which patients and families make decisions for their care that are based in their religious and spiritual beliefs and practices, but how to bridge that gap between the lack of training that medical providers often have when interacting with patients and families around religious decision making. And then finally, in workplaces, we've been working with global workplaces, large not-for-profits and corporations for about 25 years on their policies and their practices, training for the C-suite, training for managers, but also looking at providing training and opportunities for sharing of the general workforce that addresses both the workplace, the workforce, and the marketplace, and the ways in which religious belief and practice intersect with those ways. So as you can see, not a whole lot to do. And we are small but mighty, but that is a sense of the work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a design principle to you that we use in most of our trainings. And I'm just going to ask you, I'm going to bring up 2 statements, one at a time on the screen. And for those of you who are watching us at home, you can just raise your hand as well. But I'm going to bring up the statement, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you would agree or strongly agree with the statement. Okay? So the first one is, I always treat people of other religious faiths with respect. If you would agree or strongly agree with that statement, please raise your hand if you're able. Okay, just take a look around. You're sitting with the most respectful people in New York City right now. And you in your home should also feel that you are some of the most respectful people in the city. Now, for the second statement, again, please raise your hand if you agree or strongly agree with this statement. People of other religious faiths always treat me with respect. So if you would agree or strongly agree with that statement, I see a couple of hands like this, like jazz hands. So, but you can see if you're looking around the room, you can see that there's a far smaller number of people who have, and some people who very firmly actually have had that experience of respect, but far fewer of us generally have the experience of being respected by people of other religious faiths. These two statements actually come from a Gallup poll that was conducted 19 years ago. In 2004. It was called the Tolerance Index. And these are two of the statements from that Tolerance Index that people were asked to respond to. And you can see that the experience that we had in this room right now is almost exactly, even kind of like a little bit more, right? 19 years, a lot has happened. But 95% of people in that original survey said that they always treated people of other religious faiths with respect. But only 65% of the same group of people said that they experienced respect by people of other religious faiths. And there are a number of things that we could attribute this to, but at Tannenbaum, what we talk about is that there is a difference between the intent of our actions and what we think is respectful behavior and the actual impact of those actions. So very often people may think that they're acting respectfully, and they will tell you wholeheartedly, I treated that person with respect, and then they did, or then they said. And we don't necessarily take the pause to consider maybe the actions that I engaged in that I thought were so respectful and were completely in line with my beliefs, my culture, my background, may not have landed as respectful. And one of the ways in which we actualize this is that in our education work, and we've used it in our other programming as well, we engage young people. We do this training with teachers and educators, but we do it with them so that they can actually do it with students. And we ask them to identify the behaviors of respect. What does respect look like? What does respectful behavior look like? What does it sound like in the language that we use with one another? And then finally, what does it feel like? Because it's one thing to say that I'm being respectful as a state of being, but we really need to check and see what are the actions that we're engaging in? What are the behaviors that we're engaging in that are supposed to be a match for that respect? And are others experiencing those behaviors, actions, words, even our feelings? Are they experiencing that as respect? Many of us, I'm sure everyone in this room, and there are clergy in this room, so if you're not familiar with the golden rule, there's likely going to be trouble. Like the whole idea of treating others the way we want to be treated, espoused in any number of traditions, not just within and across Christianity. Want to introduce you to an idea that some of you may already be familiar with, which is the platinum rule. To treat others the way they would like to be treated. To actually consider, what does respectful behavior look like, and can I give that? Can I offer that, as opposed to solely what I think is respectful behavior? Because I'll just say this, and I'm talking about myself, and you all just happen to be here. I don't always treat myself so well. So if that's the litmus test for how I'm going to treat other people, there's some work I might need to do before I start treating people the way I treat myself. Does that make sense? Okay. So one of the ways that we talk about religion at Tannenbaum, less from a theological perspective and more from the perspective of what happens with people in the areas in which we work, in education and healthcare, in workplaces, and in peace building, is the idea that, if you will, that someone's religious experience in those areas could be divided up into these three areas that you see on the slide. That religion is composed of culture, the culture that we're in terms of our religious beliefs. What are those societal norms? What are the norms within our religious or spiritual group? Then there's belief. What do I fundamentally believe to be true, to be so, that it guides my life and it guides my actions? And then finally, practice. What are the things that I do? What are the practices that I engage in that could be a part of what happens for me at work, that impacts how I make a medical decision, that impacts what I want to teach children, and how I expect children to respond. And finally, in areas of armed conflict, how does the culture, the belief, and the practices of people who are involved in conflict either drive peace or drive discord? Now, this is, it's very heady. I understand that. But I want you to consider this as an application of that, which is, if we think about culture, belief, and practice as an intersection of our religious experience in the places where we show up in life, where would you place yourself at this intersection of culture, belief, and practice? And I want you to consider this, not where you'd like to place yourself, and not where you'd like people to think you are, but where would you place yourself at this intersection of culture, belief, and practice? I'm not going to ask anybody to share out. Nobody needs to raise a hand for this one. So I'm going to tell you, for me, I could place myself very squarely in the middle of culture and belief, and on the edge of practice. And why is that for me? Because I know that my practice is not always consistent. My practice is not always consistent with my beliefs at the moment. My practices are often, as an interfaith minister, are often in conflict with how I've been raised or the spiritual and religious tenets that I may have been introduced to. But that's where I would place myself, like squarely in the middle of culture and belief, leaning towards practice. I'm going to ask you another question. So do you have in your mind where you would place yourself? Yes? Okay. Now, how likely are people to place you where you would place yourself? Like if we went around this room and somebody said, I want you to place, what's your name, ma'am? Kathy. Went around this room and said, where do you think Kathy would be? Like there very well might be as many answers as people in the room. The people who would be closest to where Kathy places herself would know Kathy somewhat intimately. But if you think back to those first two statements I asked you about and respectful behavior, we often interact with people thinking that we know something about them when in many instances we do not. Or we don't have enough information to actually be able to discern what respectful behavior looked like, and at best, it's a crapshoot. At best, we're doing our best to be respectful, but we don't know for sure. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about why talking about religious diversity is so important today. Not just in the United States, not just in New York City, but in the world. So what you see on the slide here comes from, and I want to make sure that I'm speaking about this accurately, because this is a bit of new information that I've received. So this comes from the Public Religion Research Institute Index of Religious Diversity. And it looks at religious diversity in urban areas and in counties around the country, so all counties around the country. And what we know is that religious diversity tends to be highest in urban areas. The national average of a religious diversity score by county in the United States is 0.625%. So not even a full percent, but 0.625%. In these 10 counties, it's close to 0.9%. Of the 10 highest counties in the country, 5 of them are in the New York City area. So we have 5 of the highest concentrations of religious diversity in the nation. But what's interesting is that if you ask people, depending on how they identify, they may not feel that way. They may not have the experience of being in this big group. If we look at data from New York State and New York City, one of the things that's important to note is that the numbers are somewhat consistent in terms of New York State's religious diversity as well as New York City's diversity. They kind of mirror each other to a certain degree. One of the things that is distinctly different in both New York City and New York State are the percentages of religious minorities. So you have in New York City almost 20% combined of religious minorities, and that includes this category that says other faith, 4%, of groups of people who don't even add up to a full percent, but together they add up to 4%. You have about 20 or 21% of New York City is made up of people who are other than Christian, other than Protestant, other than Catholic, and they are not part of the unaffiliated population. So 20 to 21%. In New York State, it's more like 11, 12%. So just in terms of that comparison, if you are in the 5 boroughs of New York City, and let's count Long Island for fun, because they're not New York City. Just saying. They're lovely, just not New York City. But there's a higher percentage of diversity just in the city than in the state. But I want you to remember those numbers, about 20, 21% for New York City, about 11, 12% for New York State. When we look at national religious affiliation, and you look at the numbers of people who are part of other faiths, nationally, other faiths now includes Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, whereas in New York City and New York State, you can actually break those numbers out because the number of people who identify with religious minorities, we will say, and minorities only in the sense of numbers, of actual adherence, which is a very different kind of experience. So, do people have the experience that if you're a religious minority that you are safer because your numbers are higher? Not when rates of anti-Semitism are soaring through New York City and New York State. Not when Islamophobia is soaring through New York City and New York State. So simply having a larger percentage than the national average does not mean that you have a different experience of whether you are safe or welcome. And those are the kinds of things that we want to be mindful of in terms of the dynamics when we talk about religious diversity. I've lived in New York City my whole life, except for 4 years at college. And what I say to people is, I've been doing this work, I've been at Tannenbaum for a little over 16 years. People will say to me, oh, well, you live in New York City and it's so diverse there. And I say to them, yes, it's very diverse and people live alongside one another without often interacting with one another. Unless there is a blackout or a hurricane or a Starbucks closes. Then the whole community is up in arms. But we want to be mindful that living alongside does not mean inclusion. It does not mean that people are welcomed. And to the theme, it does not mean that people have a place at the table. And that's what we want to explore, and I understand that you all will be exploring. Another piece of data that I think is interesting, we share this usually in our workplace and healthcare programs. This was some research from the Public Religion Research Institute again, that looked at where are people most likely to interact with someone of a different faith and around different topics. So you'll see that the workplace is the highest percentage of where people are likely to interact with someone of a different religious background from themselves. Religion is the blue bar. Look at religious services. Religious services are the places where people are least likely to interact with someone of a different religious faith. And to a certain degree, that makes sense. You know, you're meeting together with people who are like-minded, et cetera. But if we're talking about pluralism, if we're talking about a place at the table, that number is going to actually have to change if we're finding ways to actually just understand one another. One of the most powerful experiences, or at least powerful things that I saw, is when the rabbi was taken hostage in Texas by the white supremacist, that's who he was, and was the rabbi, I think two of the people that worked at the synagogue were taken hostage. What happened was all of the religious leaders that he had built relationship with showed up at the synagogue to take care of the people while that crisis was going on. He built his house not in the time of trouble, but the time of peace, such that when trouble came, people self-deployed, automatically went to his aid without having to be told. They heard he was in trouble, that the community was in trouble, and they went. That's kind of how we'd want things to work. And we want to be able to identify what's in the way of that condition not taking place, of not happening. So, some practices that at Tannenbaum we talk about ways in which people can actualize this idea of building respect for a religious difference. So allyship is one of them. And allyship is a word that has become very, very popular, very common, certainly in some spaces, about how do we build relationships with quote unquote the other, et cetera. So this definition, though, I think is really important. It comes from an article that we saw in Forbes magazine. And it talks about this quote, a lifelong process. So allyship is not just a response in terms of crisis. Allyship is a lifelong process from now to the grave, that I commit myself to building relationship based on trust, based on consistency and accountability. And what often happens is that we get activated as humankind, not by any particular religious belief or practice, but crisis often evokes something that's beyond the regular way in which we do things. It makes us look beyond, or it creates a condition where we can look beyond our differences. But if we're talking about allyship, if we're talking about building a place at the table, then we're going to have to consider that that's not just for this calendar year. Building a place at the table is not just kind of like a fun theme. It becomes an expression of who we know ourselves to be. And it is committing to a lifelong process, building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability. Which means, going back to those first two statements that I asked you, when someone says that they don't feel respected, then we pause to consider, how have I participated in someone's experience of not being respected? As opposed to, I did what I was supposed to do. If you will, I did my Christian duty. And we're working with marginalized groups of people. And I want to say that, to this second point, the whole idea of marginalized groups of people Who says they're marginalized? So part of allyship is when a group of people say that they need help in some way and you offer that support, as opposed to deciding that this group of people somehow are marginalized less than us. Because it usually becomes an us and them conversation. So we want to be mindful that in allyship, and that there's not self-defined work. So, you may have had the experience where you thought someone needed something, and you provided that, and they were just a little bit less than excited about the provision of your help. I'm taking that laughter as confirmation. For those of you at home as well, you may have had that experience where you either offered to provide some help to someone and they were just kind of like, thanks. That's so nice. Or you may have needed some help at some point and weren't clear about the help that you needed, and so people came to give you help and you were just kind of like, thanks. Because what you've provided is not an answer, and now I've got to take care of you and your feelings in addition to the ongoing crisis that I'm experiencing. So when we talk about allyship, we're talking about that those efforts that we engage in have to be identified by the people who say they want help. And that an opportunity to grow and learn about ourselves. So allyship is not just about, and building a place at the table is not just about us feeling better about ourselves. That's what your barber and hairstylist are for. Or a sale at Bloomingdale's Outlet on 72nd Street and Broadway. That's where I often feel better about myself. But you get the point, right? That if we're talking about building allyship, about creating places at the table, here are some questions that I want you to consider, and I'm just going to do a time check. Okay, so I want you to consider, with the people at your table, it's fine, and you can just move to another table for the purpose of this conversation. We just give a couple of minutes to this. Who's at the table currently at St. Bart's? Who's at the table? If we're talking about building a place at the table, who's already seated? Then ask yourself, who's not present? Who's not at the table that you think could be, or maybe even should be? Why would you want to invite them? Why would you want to invite people to the table? And I'm not going to ask you to consider, but in your own discernment, also consider why you don't want to invite some people to the table. Because if you don't deal with what's your kind of that background, that agenda in the background, you'll never get done with the things that you say are what you're committed to. And then, what would you have for them when they arrive? When Meredith and I first met, I was doing a presentation at the Episcopal Parish Networks Conference, and I gave this example of someone coming to my grandmother's house after she invited them to dinner, and they come with an entree. Yeah, you get it. Like, you never met my grandmother. She's, gone on now, probably here with me right now, but like, you show up, someone invites you to dinner, and then you show up to their house with an entree, and it's kind of like, and what's that? Right? So I want to give you just a couple of minutes. I know you're not going to have time to go into deep discussion about this, but just consider these questions when you're thinking about this theme of a place at the table. And for those of you who are participating with us virtually, you might just make some notes if you have a journal, or just make some notes or some thoughts about how would you answer these questions in regards to building relationship and building a place at the table here at St. Bart's. So please take a couple of minutes and do that now, and then we'll come back together for some questions. Okay, everyone, I know that you're just getting into it and that I know that you're just getting to the edge of it. I know you are. But I also want to be mindful of time because I know that we have a hard stop before service begins. So here's the thing. The invitation is that the conversation that you just started is the beginning. And you can continue this same conversation as your considering and programming begins around building that place at the table. And these are just some questions to bring yourselves back to because one of the things about when initiatives like this is that there can be conflict. So in our conflict resolution work, but this is also a design principle that we use in our education work as well, the idea of conflict being, or responses to conflict or approaches to conflict, having something to do with us being able to address our concerns, but then the degree to which we're interested in the concerns of others. And so we often talk about compromise, like compromise often comes up. Those of you who have been married for more than a day know something about compromise. But when we're talking about approaches to conflict, one of the things we want to be mindful of is that the gold star is actually, or a north star might be, collaboration. That you are as interested in your own needs as you are in the needs of the person that you are in conflict with. That is the fertile ground where collaboration can take place, not just everybody giving something up, but actually working towards everybody getting what they want and or need. So with that, just want to offer a couple of resources. So some of these you can find on our website as well. Competencies for respectful communication. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to highlight the platinum rule, as I've already spoken about, the spokesperson syndrome. So the spokesperson syndrome is where someone speaks on behalf of an entire tradition. And you show up somewhere and someone says to you, can you tell us what the Episcopalians think about blah, blah, blah? And you humbly say, no, I cannot. What I can tell you about is my experience as an Episcopalian, and distinguishing being a spokesperson for the tradition from your own experience. Very, very critical. Too many people, particularly in our world of social media, et cetera, are very happy to be the expert on something. And who's going to challenge them? Nobody's got that kind of time. The last one also I want to bring up is acknowledge and apologize for mistakes made. Because when we're trying to build community, we're going to mess it up. At some point, we're going to step in it. We're going to say the wrong thing to the wrong person. Hopefully it's not on the wrong day, because that's a whole nother set of circumstances. But really understanding that building a place at the table, building respect for religious difference, it's not all sunshine and roses. There are going to be moments where we mess it up, but being able to be accountable, going back to the whole idea of allyship, being accountable when you mess it up and saying, yes, I am sorry, I messed that up. It was not my intention, and I want to correct it. And then finally, I'm going to go back one. Some next steps with our organization. We have a mailing list, which you can sign up for through our website. We have this event called Coffee with Mark, which is the most heinous thing to actually say when you are Mark. But it basically is just kind of like an informational online coffee hour where I give some updates on the work that we're doing. Our gala is on October the 17th this year at the Edison Ballroom. If you're interested in attending, there's information on our website about that. And then other ways that you can get involved. We have this campaign going on called 3,000 Conversations for Building Respect for Religious Difference. Conversations like these actually kind of qualify, whether it's a group or an individual, and there are ways to kind of record that information. You could host a coffee conversation. If you are interested in providing an opportunity for us to talk about our work to communities that you're a member of. We're happy to do that. And then there are always leadership opportunities on our board of directors or on a couple of committees of our board. So, and that's the presentation. So thank you so much, and we'll open it up for questions now.
Mark, thank you so much. That was fantastic, as I knew it would be. Mark, as he mentioned, spoke at Episcopal Parish Network, and he gave an amazing presentation there, and I just knew he would be great for St. Bart's. Questions for those of you in the room. Natalie has question cards, and so raise your hand and she will bring you a card and you can pass those questions up here. If you're joining us online, you can put your questions in the chat or in the comments section or email them to me at mward@stbarts.org. While we're waiting for those questions to come in,
You want me to go back to something?
well, I noticed the final point on your last slide was acknowledging mistakes. I think a lot of times what gets in our way with these conversations is the fear of making a mistake or offending someone. And it just so happens that our readings in the lectionary for today are all about forgiveness. Forgiving and being forgiven. And I think this is something that that sometimes holds us back.
Yeah.
Is that something you can speak to a little bit in those
Sure.
conversations?
So one thing that I would say is that we do have kind of an ongoing series at Tannenbaum that we called Shared Visions. And it actually looks at particular dynamics from a variety of religious and spiritual perspectives. We have one on the Golden Rule, we have one on the Platinum Rule, but we also have one on forgiveness and words from sacred texts across traditions about forgiveness. One of the things I think that's important to remember is that in conversations like these, remembering what the original intention was is really, really important. Like, why did we come together? Why did we start this process? Because that can really get lost when things get emotional or when people experience hurt, so that's one thing. I think the other thing too is that we don't think about forgiveness as a process. We often think about forgiveness more as an act. And simply because you seek forgiveness in the human realm doesn't mean that it's always able to be offered in the way in which it's given in the spiritual realm. So we think that it's enough, like we do something to someone, intentionally or unintentionally. We apologize and ask for forgiveness and expect it to be given immediately. And why do we expect that? Because we've left someone in hurt. And maybe we want to give a little bit more time to the dynamic of, I've asked for forgiveness, and I hope I get it. But how am I going to manage if I don't? If that person doesn't have the capacity to actually forgive me? And I think that this becomes potentially can become the realization, the actual practice of the forgiveness that is often spoken about in the spiritual realm.
That's wonderful. It is a process that we enter into in a dialogue. Here's a question from someone in the room. Where do non-believers, atheists, agnostics fit into Tannenbaum's work?
So all of our work, thank you for the question, all of our work is designed imagining the entire spectrum of belief and practice. So all of our work, and you see in even our public documents, that we look at the experience of religion and spirituality for people who are religious, spiritual, and unaffiliated, people of all faiths and none. In our workplace work in particular, and even in a national survey that we did in 2013, the experiences of people who identify as atheist or agnostic or unaffiliated are real experiences in a world that is often quite religiously affiliated. 40% of people who identified as atheists in the survey that we did said that they were experiencing and witnessing religious bias towards them. And that meant non-accommodation in terms of the workplace and the survey that we did. And sometimes that just looks like, stop asking me to come to church because you think something is wrong with me, or because something is, glaringly absent from my life because I don't believe as you do. So we definitely include the experiences. And we actually, one of the fact sheets, so we have a number of fact sheets around holidays. In addition to doing a fact sheet many years ago, which we've updated on the National Day of Prayer, we actually created a fact sheet on an initiative that started a few years ago called the National Day of Reason. And it is for people who do not religiously or spiritually identify, and the need for a national day to also acknowledge reason and reasoning and being of goodwill.
Thank you. Here's a question from a middle school social studies teacher in the room here, and I think it's a question that a lot of us can ask parents and folks who work with young folks. What's a good way to interrupt religiously intolerant statements in the classroom or elsewhere without speaking for students most deeply impacted by them, by those statements?
Thank you for the question. So in full disclosure, I'm a former public high school teacher. So I taught for 11 years in Brooklyn, and I was also the coordinator of student affairs for my school. And it was only after I started working at Tannenbaum I realized all of the missteps and all of the moments where I may have been offending students and not knowing that I was doing it. In regards to the question, I think if you already have guidelines within your classroom around what respectful behavior looks like. That activity that I introduced you to, that's the first part of a longer activity where young people in classroom create the guidelines for their interactions with one another. So what respect looks like, sounds like, and feels like becomes kind of the foundation of their class contract, of how they're going to interact with one another. I think definitely in our workplace work, healthcare work, and our education work, we sometimes think about addressing religion in a siloed kind of way, that it is somehow different or special than all of the other ways in which we're trying to build respect for difference. And it's not. It is a part of. And so once you have those guidelines, and students have created them and accepted them, and they also know that they have the opportunity to update them. It's kind of like the Constitution. Somebody can write a bill and suggest that we need to add some things here. That you are holding them accountable to what they said. You are holding them accountable to the guidelines that they've created for the ways in which they are going to explore difference, and that when someone is either hurt or someone experiences hurt, and that includes you as the teacher in the room, that you are able to discuss it. It also requires that you then create some kind of process by which, how do we address when there's been a misstep? What do we do? What is our process? And be consistent with that process.
I think we have time for one more question before we have to scoot out for the 11 o'clock service. But you are here this morning speaking to a room full of Episcopalians.
I'm aware.
It is not by nature a religiously diverse community. And I would expect that any faith community you would visit would be similarly homogeneous in that way. So how do faith communities, churches, synagogues, mosques, etc., reach out and do this work and engage with other faith communities and begin to learn and educate themselves?
Yeah, so I thank you for the question. Yes, I would say that yes, on the face of it, the community is very homogeneous. As you begin to have intimate conversations with one another, you might see more diversity or more diversity within people's families in terms of how they believe and practice and what their culture is. How does affiliation and attendance here fit into the larger fabric of their lives. So that's one thing. In terms of reaching out to communities, I think it's important to do a little bit of a self-assessment for the community, to kind of first individually but then collectively, like, what do we have, what do we need, and what can we provide? In the seminary that I attended, One Spirit Interfaith Seminary, one of the things that I heard for the first time there, and I hear often, is, what is mine to do? What is mine to do? We all have moments and experiences, or I believe that many of us, I'll say, have moments and experiences where we very clearly are being instructed about something. To speak to someone, pick up the phone. You see someone in service and you need to go and speak with them. You don't know why. Honoring that. What's yours to do? Because I'm going to suggest, and the invitation is, I'll just use myself as example, there are things that I know I'm likely not going to die until at least I try and do, because they've been given to me to do. And I'm going to suggest that in this theme of a place at the table, you heard those words and then there was something that occurred to you. Pretending that that didn't happen doesn't serve you, and it doesn't serve the people who are in need. And so part of reaching out to communities is also, maybe instead of, when there are communities immediately around you. I mean, Google is an amazing thing. You can literally chart the communities that are immediately around this building, and then maybe go to them and say, what do you need? How can I be of help? How can we be of help? And being very clear that you need some help too.
Mark, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have you with us this morning.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everybody online.
Hope you'll join us next week when we will be back here with Denise Mazie from the Culinary Institute of America, who will be talking to us about hospitality, continuing our theme. So thank you all very much. Join us at the 11 o'clock service beginning shortly.